All right, let's go to the respiratory system. What I suggest as you listen to the videos, I suggest that you also print out the handouts that come with it, the slides themselves. I have them posted as a full pager, which means one slide per page that you print out, but also as a two pager and as a three pager. The two pagers comes two slides per page, and the three pager is three slides. Depending on the font size, I try to make it so you can read it on a three pager, but sometimes two pages is better or easier. Okay, we first look at the function of the respiratory system. And the main function is that it harvests oxygen, O2, from the atmosphere, and then the body can use the oxygen to make energy. The oxygen is used to make ATP together with food, the glucose part. And then the other thing that the lungs do, it can get rid of gaseous waste. And a big portion of that is the carbon dioxide, which is the byproduct or the waste product we get out of using the oxygen to making the ATP, the energy. The other thing that the respiratory system does, it helps maintain the body's acid and base balance. And it does that together with the kidneys. If you look at the picture to the right, it explains it fairly decently. When we have too much or too many hydrogen ions in our system, we make the system more acidic. And the body works with a very narrow range of how acidic or how basic it can be. The bottom right part of the picture, right in here, you see some of the normal pHs for body fluids. And remember, the pH is an indicator. It's a number that shows us how many hydrogen ions are in the system, how acidic or how basic it is. The more hydrogen ions in the system, the higher the concentration of that, the more acidic the system, the lower the pH number. And the range of pH is 1 to 14. 1 is very acidic and 14 is very basic. So when we have diseases, they cause imbalances in that pH. And those imbalances then are pretty harmful to the system, to our body. And so the body needs to really get have an ability to deal with that imbalance, so we can keep it in a very narrow range. And it does that through a molecule or two molecules. It's a one molecule that changes its name and its shape depending if there is a hydrogen ion attached to it or if there is not. So we have this molecule called bicarbonate ion. It's right here, bicarbonate ion. It says HCO3 minus. The minus stands for a negative. It's a negatively charged molecule, so it's an ion. And you see there's an H, a single H. So that's the bicarbonate ion. And that ion picks up a hydrogen ion, an H plus, and then it becomes a carbonic acid. And that's an H2CO3. So now the H has two of the H's. So that's the hydrogen ion that has been attached to it. And then from there, when it picks that up, and that's actually the buffer, that's our first system. We already have these bicarbonate ions in our bloodstream, in our system, and they can pick up a hydrogen ion. And then from there, it travels to the lungs, and the respiratory system is the place where we get rid of that hydrogen ion and make a bicarbonate ion again out of a carbonic acid. And then the last system that is part of this whole triad here is the renal system, because the renal system, the kidneys, are in charge of making the bicarbonate ions. And so the system's long-term needs go up, the kidneys can make some more. So that's how we basically do that. So that's a pretty important part of the function of the respiratory system. Then let's go and discuss the anatomy. Let's talk about the anatomy. So we look at the overview here first. In order for the body cells to get atmospheric oxygen, that oxygen has to travel through air passages, ventilating the lungs. Ventilating the lungs means we bring air into the lungs. when we get this traveling of oxygen described, we talk about oxygen transport. And the air passages, meaning the places where the air passes by to get to the lungs, we call that the conducting zone. So we conduct air to the lungs to then get to the respiratory zone. And the respiratory zone inside the lungs are the little air sacs called alveoli. And in those little air sacs, the oxygen can diffuse from the air into the pulmonary capillaries. And that process from getting from the air, from the alveoli to the blood, to the pulmonary capillaries, we call that external respiration. So the term respiration refers to oxygen. And the external is the oxygen traveling from the outside air into the bloodstream. And then from there, blood vessels guide that oxygen molecule through the body's tissues to wherever there needs to be oxygen in the tissue, and it then diffuses into the tissue cells, from the blood to the tissue cells, and that's known as internal respiration. Carbon dioxide is removed from the body in a reversing order of that journey. So then the airways transport inspired and expired air. They consist of the upper and the lower air passages. So when we transport air in and out of the passages to get to the lungs, we call that ventilation. So we have on the right side, we have here the conducting passages. We have the upper respiratory passages, the upper air passages or respiratory tract. We have the nasal cavity, the pharynx, and then the larynx. And then we have the lower respiratory passages, and those are more than specifically for air. We have the trachea, the primary bronchi, and then we have the lungs. In the upper airways, what we do there, we transport the air, of course, but we also warm, we humidify, and we purify the air. So we help the air become a quality that the lungs can be happy with, that the lungs like the most. And by doing so, we can take air that is different on the outside. We can take cold air, we can take warm air, we can take dry or humid air, and we can make it all the same inside the lungs, and therefore have an environment that the oxygen can come over from the lungs into the tissues very well, into the bloodstream. Most passageways are kept moist by mucous membranes, and that's here on the side here, mucous membranes. We have goblet cells, these little cells here, that and as well as seromucous glands, and they secrete the mucus, and that's the gunky stuff that can trap things that come in, that can be coughed out or can be swallowed and gone through the digestive tract. We also have cilia, and cilia are the hair sticking out from epithelial cells, as you remember from the chapter a long time ago. The cilia are beating. They're beating in one direction, and that's the direction to bring the stuff that gets trapped in the mucus outside, away from the air passages, and so we can then again cough it out or swallow it from there. So that's how we keep those air passages clean, and how we make them moist also. Well, actually, how we make them moist, we come up with that now. So let's look at the nose first. As the air, when it comes in, it passes first as we breathe it in through the nose, which if you really want to do it proper in climates that you need to modify the air, you want to do it through the nose, especially if the air needs to be warmed. But we first get through a ring of short hairs within the nasal vestibule, and the nasal vestibule is right here, the entrance on area. And from there we get into the nasal cavity. And in the nasal cavity we have we have three of them. We have nasal concha, we have one on top, we have a middle one, and we have a bottom one. And the nasal conchas are turbinates, and what they do is they enlarge the surface area within the nasal cavities. They shape and slow the airflow, which helps warm, moisten, and purify the air. And so those are pretty important. So when we are in a climate that's cold, for example, we can breathe through the nose, and the nose, well, they might hurt a little bit because it's cold air coming in, but that there's venous plexi within that mucous membrane around the nasal concha, and they then swell up and bring warm blood to that area, and that warms up the air as the air is slowed because of the shape of the concha. And so that's pretty nifty, the way that system works out. Let's talk briefly about the paranasal sinuses, because we got around the nasal area, we got sinuses. We got frontal, we got maxillary, ethmoid, as well as phrenoid sinuses. And the names are just basically which bone are they located in. And what they do is they warm inspired air, and they also create a resonance for voice. So it's kind of like a guitar. The body of a classical guitar is what makes the string sound, the vibration of the string sound, actually get volume so we can hear it. And so that's the same thing just for our voice that the nasal sinuses do. What they do, what they are, they're chambers, and their chambers are connected to the nasal cavity. And inside their chambers we have mucous membranes. And sometimes they get infected and they make excessive mucus, and when the mucus blocks the opening trapping them inside, we can get a sinusitis, and that can be very painful because it swells up and it creates pressure. And the sinuses that are most affected by this are the maxillary sinuses. They're right in here, because what they do is they drain upward. They don't drain downward like the other sinuses, and so they get easily clogged and they swell up, and that can be very uncomfortable. What you see down here is an neti potty, which is basically a way of bringing liquid in one side of the nose, and it flushes it out, and that can be very helpful short term. But if you do it a few times, it can really make you function better than if it's all clogged up, if you have this problem. Then, posteriorly to the nasal cavity, we have the nasopharynx. So we have an area that goes up and down that is called the pharynx. The first part is the nasopharynx, and then below that we have the oropharynx, and that one is shared with air and liquid and food stuff that we take in from the mouth, which is the digestive tract, the digestive system then. And below that we get into the areas called the laryngopharynx, which is a transition place of this air, food, liquid tube into a place where the larynx is, which is basically where we split the food, water, liquid from the air. And that area is also known as the hypopharynx. And the larynx then is the place where we split the food from the air, and that's also known as the voice box, because that's also a place where we do vocalization. And vocalization is the ability, or the larynx has the ability to do that by having air coming from the lungs up into a split place where we have some strings that we can open and we can close, and create an opening that's smaller or bigger. And depending on that, we can vibrate those strings firmer or less firm and create a higher pitch or a lower pitch. And that's very interesting. But the larynx also has the ability to close the lower air passages, making it possible to raise the thoracic as well as the abdominal pressure. And that is very great when we need a strain or when we need a cough. So let's finish up this first part of it, and we're going to go to the larynx more detailed, because we're going to see how we make some voice now. And then we keep going forward.